coming up, we're going to continue the DTVC Extra look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe Phase 1 with movies Iron Man 2 and Thor. Then next week, the plan is to have Ty from Comeuppance on. We're going to look at a couple John Malkovich DTV flicks. We're going to look at One Ranger and Mind Cage. It's going to be our Melky on the Skids episode. So we haven't recorded that one yet. We're looking to record it this weekend, so hopefully we'll get it recorded this weekend and we'll be able to post it next week. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to complete the DTVC Extra look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We look at Captain America and the Avengers movie. So that should be cool there. And then, going forward, in terms of the DTVC Extra, I know we had talked in a previous episode about how I was going to essentially, retire the DTVC Extra because, the plan is to go weekly with a guest, right? And again, I do have enough guests lined up to at least get us through February into March with weekly guests. But, watching these Marvel movies that I've been, watching for this DTVC Extra series, it kind of makes me want to go through it, at least get through maybe the Infinity Saga, right? So phases 2 and 3. I don't know if I could get into 4 and 5 where you got all the TV shows and all of that. But even with the TV shows, I watched Hawkeye recently. I was going, I think before I was going to a basketball game up in Brooklyn. I was trying to get some sleep that night before. Didn't end up falling asleep. So it didn't really end up working. I ended up binging the entire series almost, except for like the last episode, which I watched on the train ride up to the basketball game. But I was like, hi, I really kind of like this Hawkeye. This is actually kind of cool. So it's kind of just gotten me into wanting to do more of these comic book things. And so one idea that I had, and we'll see, that I'm just sort of throwing it out there, is that the idea of maybe on Thursdays during the week doing the DTVC Extra. So currently, right, DTVC Extra is extra in the sense that the podcast was supposed to be bi-weekly. The DTVC Extra was ones on the other weeks, right? So it's like an extra post when you're, for the week that you're not supposed to have a podcast. Now, if I'm going weekly with a guest, or if the podcast itself is going to be weekly, then the DTVC Extra would be like an extra bonus podcast during the week, right? So you'd get your normal podcast with a guest, and then the extra would be my solo ones. I'd probably make them a little shorter, right? Not go quite as long with them, but that's something I'm throwing out there. So we'll see. We'll see as we get into February. We'll kind of see what it looks like in terms of work, those kinds of things. Because work does look like it might be ramping up a little bit, which if that's the case, then it might just be me getting those weekly podcasts in. Which is still fine. Again, it's a matter of me just sort of getting out there and scheduling and watching the movies and doing them, keeping up with the blog as well, doing the blog once a week. So we'll see what happens there. But anyway, that's the tentative plan, at least for right now. Next week, Ty from Comeuppance is on. 2 weeks, we'll have we'll finish up the DTVC Extra, and then potentially as we get into February, I might continue the DTVC Extra maybe every other week or every week on maybe on Thursdays or something like that. So we'll see what happens there. All right, in terms of the site, we just did Astro, so we finally made Astro happen. I know I've been talking about that one for a while. So that's 59 movies for Gary Daniels, and in that post I talked about I'm not sure when the next Gary Daniels post will be. Yes, we'd like to get him in the 60 Club, but how I get him in the 60 Club, it's like I'm either going to have to do one of his Christian films, which there are a couple of those that I could do still. And we've done one before. We did The Mark. That was one that had Eric Roberts in it as well, and Craig Sheffer from Nightbreed. So he was in that one. Also, what was it? He was in the, was it Code of Honor? Was that the Seagal movie that he was in? So they were in that film. The sequel, Daniels was also in the sequel to that. I don't know what's called The Mark II. I don't think it's called The Mark II. I think it's like called The Mark something else. But whatever it is, that one's available on Tubi. I could do that, but I don't know if I want to do a Christian one for his 60th movie. There's another film called The Gardener that he did with the guy that looks like Charles Bronson, Robert Bronzy. For some reason, that movie is just not available to stream here in the U.S., and I don't know why. And I don't know if I want to spend money to rent it. I just don't know that it's necessarily worth it. But maybe it would be just to get his 60th post up. But what it might mean is that he's just going to sit for a while, that we're not going to do a Daniels movie for a long time, which is very possible. We'll see what happens there. But yeah, after that, we've got Gunfight at Rio Bravo, which it was an Alexander Nevsky vanity project that Ty and I did a podcast episode on. I don't know exactly what episode it was, but it is in the archives. If you ever, now that I think about it, while we're talking about episodes that Ty and I have done, on Letterboxd, I actually have a list, a Letterboxd list that has the movies that Ty and I have done for these sort of like, 2 movie episodes that he and I were doing together. So it's not all the episodes on the podcast and all the movies we've covered, but just the ones that Ty and I have done, and these sort of those sort of two movie kind of Bruce Willis episodes. But yeah, so Gunfight at Rio Bravo is one that we did for that. Again, it's a Nevsky vanity project, Western kind of thing. And it's got some Hall of Famers in it, right? It's got Olivier Gruner, it's got Matthias Hughes. Also, fight choreography was done by Art Camacho. I believe he directed the sequel. So this one is Gunfight at Rio Bravo. I think the other one's like Taken at Rio Bravo. And I believe also Taken at Rio Bravo has some other names in it. Like I think it's got Rothrock and maybe even Don the Dragon Wilson. I know it's got Rothrock for sure. I haven't seen that one yet. I don't think it's been released yet. But anyways, that would be like 51 films for Art Camacho. So he's going to kind of keep moving up the list there. As he's our third member of the 50 club that we have now. And then looking at what I would do for after Gunfight at Rio Bravo, kind of to close out the month of January, Hunting Games, which has CT in it, CT from The Challenge. Danny Trejo's in it. Bruce Dern, right? Our favorite Bruce Dern is in it, which Bruce Dern is great. Bruce Dern seems to be playing these parts in these movies where he's just sort of like an angry boss. And he's a fantastic angry boss in this. And also, CT is like, he's like a local in like some like small Oregon town. And but he's got the thick Massachusetts accent, so it's really, really fantastic. Dude, can I bum a smoke off you? Just great stuff. So we'll be reviewing that one to close out the month of January. And then in terms of other stuff we've got going on, with the site, I think I'm up through January of 2021 in terms of the archive, like updating the archive. So all of the posts through January of 2021 you can find in the archive. And again, it's one of those deals where we're going to kind of take a month each day. So I want to say we got like maybe 150 posts left to cover to add back into the archive. So the plan is to try to keep working on that each night. I was away for the weekend, but I was able to do some. I brought my work computer with me. I was able to get some stuff done. And so I did get some done. But that's the goal, is to get that kind of up to date. And then, of course, the other project that I've been working on is going through the back catalog and removing the photo bucket images and putting in new images if we have new images. If we don't have new images, just getting rid of the photo bucket ones and uploading the images that were there before directly into the system, still linking back to the image page. So we'll see what happens there. Also, with Astro, when I was taking images for Astro, I ended up getting 4 instead of the usual 3. So I did create a new image page for that one. So I don't know going forward. I'm going to try going forward to create an image page for every post going forward. And then again, probably once I get caught up on all these back ones and getting rid of the photo bucket links, and then also the Bad Map Movie Guy links, which I haven't quite gotten far enough into the post to find those Bad Map Movie Guy links. At some point I'll probably catch up with those, right? I'll get into those as well. But we'll see. But that's, again, that's the goal. It'll be a year-long project of updating the site so that all those bad links are gone. It is something that's nice. It's nice when I go to just see maybe like my lists of posts and I'm seeing to see like one that originally had the photo bucket watermark on the thumbnail that doesn't have it anymore. It has been a good feeling. So we're going to keep working my way through that. So probably the archive should be up to date, I would say probably within the next month. I think within the month we should be able to get it. So by next month at this time, every post on the site will be in the clickable archive, and you can go in, if you know the name of the movie you're looking for, you can click for the letter and scroll down and find it and click on it and find the review. So that's the goal. By the end of the month that the archive will be up to date. In terms of the posts being up to date, I say probably by the end of the year. That's my goal, is that by December, every post will be up to date. We'll see if I'm able to keep to that. And then before we get into our theme song and start talking about Iron Man 2, we might as well just do a few plugs here. First and foremost is the novel. People have been buying the novel lately, so again, thank you for that. And if you haven't yet, I definitely I think if you're interested, you definitely should check it out. $4.99 on Kindle for Don's House in the Mountains, or $12.99 in paperback. Then of course, Bainbridge, my short action novel. I think that's one that people listening to the site would really enjoy. I think it's $2.99 on Kindle. And I don't know what it is on paperback. It might be like $8.99 in paperback. It's not that expensive. But again, Kindle is probably the way to go. And I think with something like that, again, with Bainbridge, I think if you've got a smartphone and you've got the Kindle app on your phone, you just go on Amazon and you buy it, the book, and just scroll. I have a ton of people's books that way. Let's say for me, actually, it's kind of the easiest way for me to support, other indie, self-published authors is to just buy the Kindle version of it, because it's only sending me back like $2 or $3, and they get roughly the same royalty that they would get if you bought the paperback. So, and I just think for people that listen to the site, like action movies, I think you'd really enjoy it. So you can find the link in the podcast description for that, and check that out. All right, well, that is everything. So we're going to have John from After Movie Diner and Miscellaneous Plumbing Fixtures. He is going to play our theme song here, and then we are going to come back and talk about Iron Man 2. All right, we are back, and we are going to talk about Iron Man 2. Now, before I do, I want to kind of set the stage a little bit here, just to kind of go over kind of what happened in the comic book movie world between the first Iron Man and when we get to this one, because obviously we've got 2009, right, where the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Marvel Studios, they don't release anything in that window, right? They don't have any films that come out between Incredible Hulk, right, and then Iron Man 2. We do get Punisher Warzone, which we talked about the last time, kind of what that movie was. But then, of course, we have X-Men Origins Wolverine that comes out in 2009. So one of the things I wanted to say about that movie is that, maybe the best metaphor, and I don't know how well this metaphor is going to land for everybody listening, because depending on how much of a sports fan you are, it may not land. But, of course, my favorite team is the New England Patriots in NFL football. And they had this long run. Recently, their coach, who'd been their coach for over 20 years, Bill Belichick, he just was let go. He's looking for maybe a new job as a coach. So it kind of ended an era in terms of that team and rooting for that team. For me as a Patriots fan, for about 20 years, they were the best team, and they won 6 Super Bowls in that window, made it to 3 more Super Bowls that they lost. They were winning their division, all those kinds of things. One of the things that would always happen in that run of success that they had is they would have during the NFL season. It's now a 17-game season. For much of the run, it was a 16-game season, but it was 17 weeks. So you'd have 16 games, and then somewhere in that season, you'd have a week off that they would call a bye week. And what would always happen with the Patriots is that when they would be in their bye week, the teams that they were competing with, there'd be like maybe 2 or 3 teams that season that had maybe a better record than them, or were pushing them to maybe, compete for a better record. And in that bye week, at least one of those teams would either lose to a team that they shouldn't have lost to, or they'd have like a real catastrophic injury, like their quarterback would be injured, which in American football, if your quarterback is injured, it almost signals death. I mean, one great exception, of course, is my Patriots losing to the Philadelphia Eagles, who had a backup quarterback, but for the most part, if you lose your quarterback, it's bad. And so the joke would always be with the Patriots is they would be during their bye week where they wouldn't be playing at all, and then during that week they'd come out of it better than they were the week before without having even played a game. And so that's kind of the way I feel like with the Marvel Studios, where they didn't make any films in 2009, but they come out of it ahead because of how bad X-Men Origins Wolverine was. And I think, when I'm sort of, furthering that analogy, X-Men Origins Wolverine, that is like losing, a really good NFL football team losing to a team that they shouldn't. Because X-Men Origins Wolverine, it was a movie that had Wolverine, Gambit, and Deadpool in it. And there's really no way that you should be making that movie badly, right? The only way that they make that movie badly is they mess with the source material on such a level that it's just downright offensive to the fans. And that's what they did, right? I mean, Gambit is barely in the movie. He's not even listed as Gambit on the credits, right? He's listed by, I think, Remy LeBeau is his actual name or whatever in the series. So he's not even listed as Gambit. And Deadpool, what they do with Deadpool is just, it's a crime against humanity, right? Of course, it's so bad that, when Deadpool 2 comes out, right, they make fun of it, and he supposedly goes back and kills that timeline or whatever. it's the worst thing that they could have possibly done. And I don't know who, like we were talking about in the last episode when I was talking about the first Hulk movie, the Ang Lee Hulk movie, and how I love Ang Lee as a director, and didn't want him to, hated having to say that I hated his movie, or didn't like his movie when he was, he's such a great director. I mean, Gavin Hood also is a really great director, but I don't even know that I can blame him for the issues with X-Men Origins Wolverine. I mean, I don't think he's just directing it. I don't think he's the one who's like, yeah, let's just completely turn Deadpool into some weird amalgamation of weird stuff that doesn't even make any sense. When, as a character, he's like, I mean, Deadpool as a character, he is one of the ones. I mean, I remember when he had his first appearance. I remember when he was first, coming out. And I remember, I think it was X-Force 2 was his second appearance, maybe, or one soon after his first appearance, and everybody was excited to get that issue. Yeah, I mean, there's the cover where he's fighting this other guy named Kane, who was like the Weapon X at that time, and you see them on the cover, right? Like they're fighting on the cover of it. It looked fantastic. And that's who Deadpool was, right? Deadpool was one of those characters that made Rob Liefeld. I mean, he's just, he said in an interview that he was told when he was working on New Mutants that he couldn't use Wolverine or Spider-Man. So he essentially invented his own versions with, Cable being the Wolverine and Deadpool being the Spider-Man. But now Deadpool is on his own. He is, up there, maybe your top 5 most iconic and most popular Marvel figures, right? I mean, you can't, when I think of like for example, the Marvel Puzzle Quest game that I play on my phone, I mean, that's just, Deadpool's all over that, right? He's a major piece of that. Any kind of video games that came out using Marvel characters, right? Deadpool would be a huge piece of it. So the idea that you would mess with Deadpool, and granted they fix it later on down the road, but the idea that you would mess with it, you wouldn't just go like, look at how cool this character is, and look at how much everybody wants this guy in the game, and we think Ryan Reynolds is a perfect person to play him, and we could do all this really great stuff with him, and then you just be like, no, let's throw all of that in the trash and just do some random thing where he's like a mix of other characters and he doesn't even look like Deadpool and all this other stuff. Why would you do that, right? But anyway, so I mean, and to be fair, I mean, I don't know if it does irreparable damage to the Fox's X movies, but it does hurt them, right? I mean, people kind of don't trust them as much, and in the next segment, we're going to talk about X-Men First Class a little bit. And I think part of the reason why that one doesn't do as well as they were hoping it would, and it probably should have done better, is because it took some time for people to come around and trust, Fox's X movies again. They do redeem themselves, I think, with Logan, which I haven't seen yet, but I've heard a lot of good things about that. And so, it's one of those things where, I don't know, for Marvel Studios, right? With people looking at Iron Man 2 coming out that next year, Iron Man 2 suddenly looks a lot better if they just get it right? They just had to get it right, which when we talk about it, they do get it right. But it was one of those deals where again, X-Men Origins Wolverine, it should have been a slam dunk movie. It should have been with any kind of movie. Again, if you're making a movie with Deadpool, Wolverine, and Gambit in it, I mean, that's a dream trio in a movie. And then if you added in people like Cable and Domino, I mean, that would have easily been like, $750 million out of the box, right? Just right away. And I mean, the fact that it even made over $300 million, I think, is because people were expecting something good, and then word got out like how bad it was, and suddenly people stopped going and wanting to see it. So, so that's one of the things that happens in 2009 that I want to discuss. The other thing, of course, is that Disney buys out Marvel. So they buy Marvel in its entirety, including Marvel Studios. And at the time, of course, they honor the contracts or the agreements that Marvel Studios had with Paramount to release the upcoming movies. So that's why if you look on Wikipedia, if you look up the movies, it will say up through Avengers that they are, or up to Avengers, right? That it'll say Paramount is the distribution company for those, and then Avengers is the first one, right? That's listed as Walt Disney, Walt Disney Studios or Walt Disney Pictures. What happens though is that with the Paramount ones, I think what they do is I think they buy the rights, because I think Paramount still had the right to Avengers as well. What they bought out the rights and gave, they still made some money off of it, but that's essentially what happens there. So with Walt Disney, of course, with Disney buying Marvel, that's going to change, I think, how Marvel Studios works. And of course, Marvel, it ends up being one of multiple cogs in Disney's attempt to just essentially to dominate the film industry, right? Soon after, they're going to have the rights to, they've either already gotten the rights to Star Wars, or they're getting them soon after, right? They're going to be buying those from Lucas. And so it's one of those things where, Avengers is the top movie when it comes out, and then when the second Avengers comes out, it's not the top movie because it's a Star Wars movie that's the top movie, right? And then you still got Pixar movies that are big, and they're still, remaking Disney movies. So at that time, Disney, this was just like the first cog, right? This was the kind of the first step. But what we're going to see as we kind of go along in this Marvel Cinematic Universe, the look at these movies, is that this earlier phase of things, this first phase, where they're sort of putting out a movie or two every year, and they're not really, inundating us with too much, that changes, right? When Disney gets a hold of it, they start to want to pump out more and more. And so, I think as we talk about Iron Man 2, it's going to be interesting to look at how Iron Man 2 builds and creates this massive thing versus kind of what Disney's been doing with Marvel Studios and sort of how it looks today. So that gets us to, of course, to Iron Man 2. And so, with Iron Man 2, they had the idea that they were going to make an Iron Man 2 as, given if the first one worked. And the first one does work, right? It is, it's not this massive financial success, but it's financial success enough, right? It's a top 10 movie for that year. It met with a large critical amount of success as well. I mean, people really, really liked it. People were looking forward to a sequel. And so once they knew they had that success, they were already thinking of a sequel, so they start putting it together and start making it. And one of the things I think about this movie as a sequel, and of course, we'll do a quick synopsis here in a bit, but I think one of the interesting things about it as a sequel for comic book movies is it's unique as a sequel because most sequels, what's great about most comic book movie sequels is that you've gotten the origin story out of the way, and now you can really just let the hero rip, and that's why we get a lot of great second movies. Batman Returns is a really great one. I don't even know if that's necessarily because of the origin story piece, but it's just more like Tim Burton had some extra money, and he just really just went for it. But that's probably one of my favorite comic book movies ever is Batman Returns. Superman 2, right? That one's a big one where we get the origin story out of the way. We can just jump in and fight Zod. And I know there's the two versions. There's the Donner cut, and then the one that was kind of the one that was released more widely. But still, as a sequel, it's a really great one. Spider-Man 2, right? Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire, they kind of build off that first movie and make something really, really, really great. So sequels tend to be really good for comic book movies. What's interesting with Iron Man 2 is that Iron Man 2 as a sequel is not just simply furthering the Iron Man story, right? But it's starting to set pieces in place that are going to build to the Avengers. So as much as it's a part 2 for Iron Man, it's also a part 3 of 6 for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this is the first time we've really seen something like this in a film series. And so it kind of makes this Iron Man movie a little bit unique in that sense as far as the sequel goes. I don't think, I'm trying to think of other sequels that really match the way that they did this. And to be honest though, I think the thing that they did really well with it that made it work so well is that they were able to split the difference enough where they were able to give us enough of what we wanted to keep us watching these Marvel Cinematic Universe movies and get us to that point where, Avengers become such a huge hit. But yet stick enough with the individual storyline that we have with Robert Downey Jr. and his development as a person that was so big in the first film that really drew people in for that first movie, that human story, which, if you think about, remember Martin Scorsese when he was complaining about Marvel movies and he was like, oh, nobody, these movies, that there's no human element to them. There's no development of character, all of these kinds of things. It's just, people fighting bad guys and breaking buildings and stuff. The Iron Man movies actually do have that, right? The Iron Man films really do lean into that human element of it. The story of Tony Stark and his journey is very compelling, and Robert Downey Jr. makes it compelling. Jon Favreau and the writers, in this case we have Justin Theroux as a screenwriter, they really hone in on that element to make that part compelling. So in a way, it's interesting because if we're looking at Scorsese's criticism, it's almost like Iron Man sort of proves his point because it is such a great movie because it has those pieces that he thinks a movie needs to have to be a good movie. I'd be curious to know what he thinks of Iron Man, but I have a feeling he would like the two Iron Man movies. And I think maybe to his point, right, that when Disney takes over these movies, they make them into something that maybe he doesn't recognize or doesn't enjoy as a film. So, it's interesting to think about. I did hear some people talking about the fact that there's an interesting irony in the fact that Killers of the Flower Moon did better than the Marvels, which I saw the Marvels in the theater, not Killers of the Flower Moon, because I'm not going to see a 3-hour plus movie that doesn't have an intermission. That's not necessary. And no movies in the past, the movies that were made in the 60s, like Lawrence of Arabia, that were that long, or Gone with the Wind, which was made in the 30s, but movies that were made in the past that were that long had intermissions. So that's just my thing with Killers of the Flower Moon. I'll see it eventually. So, but just kind of as a side there. But anyway, let's get in a little bit on Iron Man 2. So from a story standpoint, we have 3 points of conflict here in Iron Man 2. So we've got Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. He's become this big celebrity. His company has turned around on the back of him being this big celebrity. So in the first movie, right, they were no longer designing weapons of war; they were trying to design weapons of peace. And now with the Iron Man suit, suddenly everybody wants a piece of Stark Industries, right? And they're suddenly rich again. So he decides to run this year-long expo over near the Javits Center in Manhattan, in New York, which it's an area I know. I've gone to a convention there before. Also, it's near the 7 train, which the 7 train is what you take to go see Mets games. So if you're walking from Penn Station, it's actually about a 15-minute walk there. So I just know that area. So just kind of throwing that out there. But anyway, So he's doing this expo thing, but at the same time, the arc reactor thing that's keeping him alive, that's in his chest, it's using an element called palladium that is poisoning his blood. And so he knows he's going to die. And so there's this nihilistic thread that's going through him because he knows he's about to die. He's not able to find a cure. He's essentially just staving off the inevitable. So that's the first piece, right, is that Tony Stark thinks he's dying. The second piece is that his father had worked on something with with an old colleague of his, and that colleague, I guess what they were working on, the colleague wanted to. I'm trying to think how it was. He wanted to sell the product, I guess is what the idea was. So there was a falling out, and in the movie, the way we get it set up is that the falling out was the father was kind of destitute in Russia, and Mickey Rourke is his son. And when the father dies, Mickey Rourke takes the father's plans and decides he wants revenge on Tony Stark. And he essentially becomes two characters. Right? He becomes Whiplash. That's essentially who his character is Whiplash, but also elements of the Crimson Dynamo. So I know Whiplash was more of an Iron Man villain, but then Crimson Dynamo was, I think, kind of Iron Man / Avengers villain. I don't remember so much, but that's kind of the idea. But anyway, so he attacks Tony Stark and Iron Man when Tony Stark's running a race in Monaco. He's racing the car, which again, he's racing the car because he thinks he's going to die, so he wants the experience of racing in an F1 race. And he's attacked. Tony Stark defeats him, and so Ivan Vanko is put in prison. That brings us our third piece of conflict here, and that is his competing company, Hammer Industries, run by Sam Rockwell, who plays Justin Hammer. They have been tasked by the U.S. government to sort of come up with an alternative to what Tony Stark has, because Stark Industries refuses to sell, or Tony Stark refuses to sell the Iron Man technology to the U.S. government, but they want it, right? Of course, the U.S. Army and government would want it, right? They want to be able to use it to vanquish their enemies, right? Because not have to worry about wars or anything like that, right? So he's Sam Rockwell is trying to beat. He wants to beat out Stark Industries, and so when they capture Mickey Rourke's character, Rockwell busts him out and tasks him with using his knowledge to create his own alternative to Iron Man stuff. And then, of course, at the same time, while Tony Stark is going down this nihilistic path, he runs into Don Cheadle takes one of his Iron Man suits, right? Because they kind of have a fight in Iron Man suits, and he just flies off with it. Now the government has their Iron Man suit because Don Cheadle has it. He's given it to them, and Rockwell's kind of fitted out to kind of make it into what we know as the War Machine suit. So these things are happening, and we get to that point where kind of all hope is lost, right? Because Robert Downey Jr. he's close to dying. He's given away his suit to Don Cheadle to do what he wants with it. He's just kind of in that place, and that's when Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson, shows up. And one of the pieces that it's revealed is that this woman who's been working as an intern or a legal I don't know what exactly her was, legal clerk, something like that with them. Scarlett Johansson, she's actually the Black Widow who's been spying on him the whole time. But Samuel Jackson says, hey, your father was working on some stuff. I think, he might have the key to what will, again, kind of fix this problem that you have with the blood poisoning. Sure enough, it works. He flies out to New York in his Iron Man suit, and they fight Mickey Rourke. So Mickey Rourke, of course, took advantage of Justin Hammer, Sam Rockwell, wanting to use his talents, and he just kind of creates his own army of drones, and they have to defeat the drones, and that's kind of it. That's everybody's happily ever after. It was quite a little bit more convoluted of a plot than the first one was, so there's a lot more to explain there. But again, like I said, we had 3 conflict points in there. And I think for a 2-hour movie and having 3 conflict points, I think they did a pretty good job of weaving them together, right? And making it so we don't have a lot of dead moments, that we don't have a lot of extra. Again, this is 2 hours for a comic book movie. Yes, I know, the Marvels was only an hour 45, but most of these movies, these big blockbusters, they're at least running 225, 230. But some cases, right, we're getting into the 3-hour range with these. So to have 3 conflict points over a 2-hour span, that's something that we just don't really see much anymore. But they do it well. They weave the story well. Again, I don't like this one as much as the first one, and I think part of it is because they have to sort of split that difference between making this an Iron Man movie and then making this a movie that sets up the rest of this Marvel Phase 1, right? So we get the introduction of Scarlett Johansson as the Black Widow, which the way they bring her into the film, I thought was a really great way that they did it, where she's just there. She has one kind of fight scene where she is sparring with Jon Favreau, and she puts him into like a wrist lock or something. So we get a little taste of how good she is, but really it's not till the very end where she has like this one scene where she just beats up a whole bunch of guys, which is really cool. I think it's kind of a cool way to introduce a character that we know is going to be in later films, to just have that one kind of scene there at the end. And I think, again, it was a good way for them to split the difference in terms of like making this an Iron Man movie, but then still introducing Black Widow, or bringing more of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury into it, or Clark Gregg as Agent Coulson. They were able to give us more of those characters, but not make them detract too much from Tony Stark's story, which is what was the most important piece. So I thought that was really good. Mickey Rourke as the baddie, he's one of my favorite Marvel baddies. I loved his performance here, and the thing is, I think the thing that we kind of forget now, because Mickey Rourke now is the DTV movie mainstay, right? It's like you're just going to see him in whatever, as many whatever direct-to-video stuff. Like, I don't know the last thing he did that was a big theatrical piece, but it's like a lot of low-budget stuff, and it's a lot of small, low-budget scenes, right, that he's in. He's not doing, he shows up in a Dolph movie with as a World War II colonel wearing a cowboy hat, right? That's kind of what he does. Thing is, right, in 2010, when he was the baddie in Iron Man, he had done The Wrestler in 2008, and that really brought him back into the fore, because it was such a great performance as the Ram in Wrestler. That's one of my favorite movies and one of my favorite performances from him. He's had some really great performances. Obviously, you think it's something like in 9.5 Weeks. It was one that he did in the early 80s called Barfly, where he was kind of being Bukowski, I think, right? He's Charles Bukowski is essentially like roughly that character. That was one that I really liked as well. But he's an actor that I really enjoy, and he just was really great here as a villain. And he plays a villain in a way that I don't know that a Disney Marvel movie would want him playing this part. And so he brings a lot more nuance, I think, to the part than I think like maybe a Disney movie or Warner Brother or any of those like kind of big budget films would want that. They want kind of a more straight ahead, just show up and chew the scenery and blow things up and be just like a really cool baddie, right? And what Rourke does here is he gives you some element of one, like maybe he's someone who he might be a sympathetic figure, right? We don't know that, right? And so that's one area for him. The way he interacts with like Sam Rockwell's character, you kind of root more for him than you do Rockwell's, which I like that as well. He also brought some elements, like he really kind of studied sort of like Russian prisons and kind of wanted the character to kind of have that vibe. He brought up things like he wanted the character to have a bird with him, stuff like that. Like he added all of these little elements, and it's the kind of thing that I think if you were going to bring on somebody to be a baddie in a movie now, they they wouldn't let you do any of that stuff. They'd be like, no, this is what we want the baddie to be. You could do some things within that, but you can't add too much. For me, that kind of makes this one really great. That Rourke is really being Rourke, and he's really allowed to be Rourke in this sense. And he brings a baddie to this that I don't think I wouldn't have expected in this movie. But again, when the movie came out, I do have to remember that when this movie came out, of course, Rourke being the baddie made absolute sense, right? I mean, he would have been at the top of the list of who you'd want to play a baddie in a big budget blockbuster based on how well he did in The Wrestler. I mean, he was nominated for an Oscar in The Wrestler. And so, once you're back in like that, then you start getting these parts. It didn't take long for him to lose those parts, so I don't know what happened there. It was like kind of a brief thing. I think if you look at his bio, it's like he does The Wrestler, he does the Informers. I don't know what Kill Shot is. He does the Wrestlers, but the Informers, that was based on a Bret Easton Ellis novel. That I actually saw that one in the theater. A friend of mine wanted to see it, so I saw it in Portland, Maine at the theater. Yeah, Kill Shot, that's right. It had Thomas Jane and Diane Lane. That was a big budget film as well. So he was doing bigger stuff, right? Oh, it also had what's his name in it? Why, it's horrible that I can't think of names ever. Joseph Gordon-Levitt. So he was doing bigger stuff, right, with bigger people and that kind of thing. But it didn't last, right? It's not long before he's back to direct-to-video stuff. I mean, he did The Expendables in 2010, and then that was it. Like, we kind of didn't see him much anymore. Or we do see him, right? We see him on our site, of course, right? We see him in direct-to-video movies. But the big budget thing was kind of done for him after that brief spell there. But while he was in that brief spell, right, we got him in Iron Man 2, which was really cool. Of course, the other piece, right, is that Don Cheadle takes over for, again, just losing out on names here, just because that's who I am, and I'm bad on names, and I should have even had it up already, but I didn't. Terrence Howard. I wanted to say Terrence Stamp, which of course I think the reason why I wanted to say Terrence Stamp, right, is because I was thinking Superman 2 earlier when I was talking about movie sequels, and I knew it wasn't Terrence Stamp. Obviously, it was Terrence Howard is his name. Don Cheadle takes over for that. It's interesting because, right, we have this whole conversation now about what do we do about Kang the Conqueror now that Jonathan Majors is no longer working with Marvel, right? He was fired after he was convicted of domestic violence charges. So there's a talk about, well, what do we do now? Do we reset? Do you have a new villain? But it doesn't make any sense why you wouldn't just replace him, right? You just put somebody else in as Kang the Conqueror. I think there was a sense that he was so good as Kang the Conqueror, but I don't know. I haven't seen any of the movies where he's in it as Kang the Conqueror, but I think considering what we did here, where we've got Don Cheadle just swapping in as Terrence Howard, it worked fine enough. I don't think anybody was like, man, that guy doesn't look a lot like Terrence Howard at all. It's a comic book movie. You can replace those actors. Which, on the other hand, right, it kind of makes it tough because as an actor, it's harder to have leverage, right, with the scene. And granted, like if you're someone like a Robert Downey Jr., who's just so iconic and he just nails that part so well in the first Iron Man movie. There's no way you could make another Iron Man without him playing Iron Man, right? So he's got the leverage that he could ask for anything, right, and get the number that he wants for that. Terrence Howard's character is not quite as integral to the film, and so when you replace him with Don Cheadle, and to be honest, I kind of like Don Cheadle's interactions with. I think he works better with Robert Downey Jr. I kind of of course I'm a huge Don Cheadle fan, so that's probably also part of it. Is not that I don't like Terrence Howard, but Don Cheadle is one that I've just always been a fan of. So seeing him here was good there. But anyway, so he kind of takes that over there. I was trying to think if there's anything else in this, because I mean, there's a few other pieces. Like I like John Slattery playing Tony Stark's dad. He's really cool in that part. He's really great as that kind of character. So that's always something I always like, kind of seeing him in something like this. I think, this movie does what you want the sequel to do. And, it makes, more money, of course, than the first film. So the first film made actually, it doesn't make that much more than the first film, actually. That's something interesting to think about. It cost them $60 million more, but it only made them about like 40 something, million more. It's interesting because the part 3, when that one comes out, that one, that's the one that gets them over $1 billion, I believe. Iron Man 3 is $1.2 billion. But I think one of the things we'll talk about here, especially when we get into Thor, is how there's a kind of an Avengers bump that comes with these movies. There aren't many of them that are solo ones that make in the billion that making the $1 billion range that aren't either between Avengers movies or like kind of leading up to Avengers movies. In fact, it kind of shows that even something like an Ant-Man, the fact that it makes any money at all is probably because it comes on the heel. Most of the time they come on the heels of Avengers movies, those Ant-Man movies. But that's really kind of what I mean. The only exception is Captain America: Civil War, right, which is like almost like an Avengers movie, and so that's really. Those Avengers ones were the ones that pull in the big money, and it is interesting that they're kind of expecting all of these movies to make a lot of money. But I think for Iron Man 2 to make to be a $200 million project, make $600 million. But the other thing is what it sets up, what Iron Man starts to build on. It's one of those things that it feels like with Marvel, with Disney now, they need all of the movies to pull in big numbers. Whereas with these movies back then, it wasn't about each individual one. Yes, they wanted each one to make its own money, right? Each movie did need to make enough money. But the key was to build to that Avengers movie. And this is still kind of building to that here, right? This movie, it's sort of taken with the story of Iron Man, it's furthered that, but then it's also added in some characters like Black Widow to kind of let us know that we're building to something bigger, right? And it kind of it teases us that the Thor movie is going to be coming out the next year, so we know that that's coming too. And again, I think the other thing is just looking at the timeline here, and I think this is something that when we get to the end of this, it'll be interesting to talk about. But no movies in 2009. One movie in 2010 and then 2 in 2011, right? So that's the timeline that we're looking at here. So we've got time to kind of let Iron Man 2 marinate. And in fact, it's actually, I believe it's the only comic book movie that comes out in 2010. DC had Jonah Hex, which was like loosely based off of the comic book. Barely made anything, right? It was a $47 million movie that made like $10 million. So it just didn't do well at all. So really, like, Iron Man kind of has the year to itself for 2010, which I think is, it's definitely, I want to say, like, I think it helps it for us as fans to really enjoy it. I can't think of another year, right, where you'd have that kind of thing, right? I mean, how often do you nowadays, right? I mean, of course, I think after Avengers, I think it's every year has at least 2 Marvel movies until 2020, where there's no Marvel movies. But not only that, you start to get into 3 movies a year, right? Which is a common thing too. So to have, I think that helped Iron Man to keep building on what it was, that it was the only comic book movie really to come out that year. I was trying to think what else came out that year, 2010. I mean, yeah, you got a Harry Potter movie, Twilight movie, those kinds of things. But really, Iron Man 2, it's not, it's a top 10 movie for that year. It's not, one of the best, but, it was allowed to kind of, be its thing. I mean, it's close to Twilight. I think Twilight was kind of wrapping up at that time. Harry Potter was starting to wrap up at that time. That was a big one in 2010. But really, Iron Man was your one comic book movie. So it was allowed to kind of exist in its own space, I think, which I thought was kind of cool. And I think we don't think about that as much anymore, that as Marvel was building their cinematic universe, and Iron Man was really like the key to it, which is, again, really interesting. And as we talk about Thor, I want to get into this a little bit more, but the fact that Iron Man was the key, that was the one that they built everything off of, and that started the whole thing, when, again, he was a character in the comics who, his own books didn't really do that well. People liked him in the context of Avengers or in the context of like other people's books, and making a guest appearance in Spider-Man or something like that. But his own book didn't always do that well, and he's not really one of the. I mean, we were just talking about Deadpool in earlier in this segment, and I mean, Iron Man compared to Deadpool is like there's no. I don't say no comparison. Like there's no competition there, right? Deadpool is way bigger than Iron Man. But the fact that they turned Iron Man into something like that, where he's been turned into this one of Marvel's biggest properties, and also that he's the thing that they've built the whole cinematic universe off of, at least for this first phase of it. I think is really, really cool, and I think it's a testament just to the fact that they did it right. That Robert Downey Jr. came in as the character. He played it right, and he plays it right here as well. And I think it's another piece with Robert Downey Jr. is just because he's such a great actor that he can kind of play all the different facets of this Tony Stark character, which in the comic books he didn't really have these facets, right? He's Robert Downey Jr. is adding these facets to it. But, Favreau as a director is really letting him go for it. There's still the will they or won't they element with Gwyneth Paltrow. And again, Gwyneth Paltrow, all the things we could say good or bad about her, in these films, she's really great. It all of it kind of works. And again, Mickey Rourke is the baddie, which is fantastic. And then of course you have Sam Rockwell as more of like a heel version of a baddie, which again, just it all kind of works in that sense. So yeah, I think this is, in terms of movie sequels, I don't know where I put this one because it's a very different kind of sequel because it's not a traditional part two, but I like it in that sense that it's sort of building up into these other movies. And one of the things I realized, maybe as I'm wrapping up here, and maybe it's something good for me to talk about too, because I never really watched Iron Man 1 and 2 in the context of the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe before, like I'm doing it now. I realized as I was watching part two that I actually hadn't seen part one or part two before outside of watching them with riff tracks. So at that time in the late 2000s, early 2010s, riff tracks, right, was, Mike Nelson, and he would have the audio file that you would sync up when you're watching the movie. So it'd be like, you'd hit a certain point in the movie and you'd start his audio file and he would make fun of the movie as you were watching it. And that was how he did Iron Man 1 and 2. I think part 2 may have had some of the other guys that join him now on the riff tracks. But I think for Iron Man 1, I think it was just him. And my buddy and I and his wife, we would watch a lot of movies with riff tracks. We would do like, I think we did the Hunger Games movies, the Twilight movies. So like Iron Man 1 and 2, I remember, I didn't realize that I hadn't watched part 1 without the riff tracks until I was watching part 2. And I was like, it dawned on me that I hadn't seen either of them. So it's really interesting watching them for this time around that this is my first time watching them without somebody making fun of them at an audio track that was synced up with it. It was just me watching them on my own. So that was one thing that was unique. But the other thing, of course, is watching them for the first time in the context of the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like when I watched these back in the early 2010s, late 2000s, I was watching them on their own. I was watching Iron Man and Iron Man Part 2, and yes, I understood that there were other characters that were being added in, but I wasn't really seeing it as Marvel building to something. I was just more watching the Iron Man movies. I think, again, being a Robert Downey Jr. fan, it kind of helped to see them in that context. So it is interesting to see now how they're building to something bigger and how that's all playing out. All right, so what we'll do here is we'll take a break, and then we will come back and we will finish up with Thor in the next segment. It's the early 90s in LA. The war on drugs is raging, and Detective John Bainbridge is the LAPD's secret weapon against crime. Former Special Forces in Nam, he's a cop on the edge. When he and his partner Geary uncover a potential human trafficking ring, it doesn't take long before John Bainbridge realizes this thing goes all the way to the top, which doesn't scare him. That just means they'll fall that much harder when he takes them down. Part send-up and part love letter to early 90s action films, Bainbridge will take you back to the golden days of Canon, PM Entertainment, and AIP. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited from Amazon. Follow the link in the podcast description. My newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains, is available now. It follows Don Veazey, who after 20 years has finally made it as a writer, going from an AP English teacher to richer and more famous than he ever could have imagined. In the process, his wife Lois, feeling alienated and resentful of her husband's success, has filed for divorce, forcing Don to move to a house in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. With time alone to reflect, he's able to see how his new wealth and fame has affected his life in ways he never expected. Maybe the biggest of these is his new house, which is bigger and nicer than anything he's ever had in his entire life, but the longer he lives there, the more he gets the sense that it might have magical powers. But that can't be right. A house can't have magical powers, can it? Pick up Don's House in the Mountains today. You can find it at Amazon in paperback and in Kindle. All right, we are back, and we are going to wrap up here by talking about Thor from 2011. So this was one of the ones that I hadn't seen before when I started doing this. And actually, one thing I looked at when I looked at IMDb, or not IMDb, actually it was Wikipedia, for the list of movies that are based off Marvel properties or Marvel publications, I had actually seen all of them up to Thor, and I hadn't seen Thor or X-Men First Class, so I ended up watching both of those for this. So I think... because I haven't seen the Avengers yet as well. I want to say there's like 38 Marvel movies that I haven't seen, but they're all after this one here, after X-Men First Class. So I've seen Captain America, I've seen Ghost Rider, which we'll be covering with Mitch coming up, and then I hadn't seen the Avengers. But yeah, I mean, I think there's 38 Marvel movies that I haven't seen before, and they're all after. I mean, there was definitely some that I've seen after Thor or X-Men First Class. So there are definitely some that I have seen that are more recent, but that's where the bulk of the ones I haven't seen before are. So yeah, a lot of catching up to do if I was going to watch them all. I mean, 38, that's a lot of movies. I don't know if I'll get to them. And that's all across all Marvel, and it's all live action for Marvel, but it's across all Marvel. So it includes like the X-Men movies. It includes the different Spider-Man or Spider-Verse movies that are on Sony. Guess it also includes that Fantastic Four reboot, which I don't know if I'll see that or not, but we'll see. So that gives you a sense there. With Thor, I think Thor's an interesting one to think about just because just going into the fact that they were using Thor as a character. I mean, we talked about Iron Man being kind of a lower tier Marvel character. Thor's even another tier down, right? I mean, I remember them trying to, them having him in a Hulk movie, a Hulk TV movie in the late 80s. So I remember Thor being in that. The other thing, of course, I remember with Thor was Adventures in Babysitting, right? Where the sister was all into Thor, right? And she had like the Thor helmet in the comics and all of that stuff. And that's kind of what Thor was, right? Thor was like a comic book that like you'd see at yard sales or something, and you'd be like looking for, some older person would have them. And of course, these would be huge collector's items now, but you'd see like these Thor comics from like the 60s and 70s. And, they'd be like with Sergeant Rock comics and whoever else, right? And be like, where's the Spider-Man ones, right? I can't find the Spider-Man ones, or the X-Men ones or whatever, right? I'd be looking for like old X-Men ones or something. And here's Thor. And I'm like, well, what do I want with Thor? I mean, that's kind of who Thor was, right? I remember collecting comics in the late 80s, early 90s. And, when you'd read through a comic, there would be like the subscription page where you could sort of check off boxes and send it in and subscribe to certain comics. And Thor was one that seemed to kind of come in and out, right? Like they would sort of reboot it, retry it. And it just never really worked, I think, as a comic book. But, within the Avengers, right, you couldn't have the Avengers without Thor. So, again, similar to Iron Man, it's interesting, right, that they're sort of, trying to build up this, Thor in this. But again, it kind of goes back to sort of the idea of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe was supposed to be, where, you talked to Kevin Feige about, he looked at the characters that Marvel Studios had the rights to and thought, oh, we could make our own Avengers. And of course, if you're going to make your own Avengers, you have to have Thor in the Avengers. So then it's a matter of like, okay, how do we make him big enough that he could have his own movies and be compelling enough to kind of build this thing further? And that's what their attempt is. I don't think Thor has ever quite gotten to be the level of Iron Man in terms of like, the big property kind of thing, even though he's got 4 movies out at this point. But it is interesting to think about Loki, right? I mean, if you go on Instagram or Reddit or Twitter or whatever, I mean, how many cats and dogs are named Loki now, right? I mean, everybody names their dog Loki, it seems like. Everybody knows somebody who has a dog named Loki. There's probably people listening here who have a dog named Loki or a cat named Loki, right? But at the very least, you probably know someone who's named your animals Loki. So it's interesting that it wasn't Thor that became the big one, right? It was Loki that became the real I'd say like he's the real popular one. And it's interesting because in this first film that we're going to be talking about, he's just a straight up baddie, right? But then he sort of progresses. It's almost like a Fast and Furious kind of thing, right? With Loki, where he starts to become kind of more of like an anti-hero, and he sort of, he joins with the heroes in some sense, which is really interesting, right? That he's sort of taken on that change because he's more of a baddie here, but he's the one, right, that becomes the iconic figure in the zeitgeist, not Thor so much. All right, so I want to get into quickly. I'll get into the plot here a little bit. So essentially, with the plot, it's your Thor, right, is in Loki, right? They're brothers. Odin has in the past has fought the frost giants, and he's defeated them, and now he's got his 2 sons, Thor and Loki. They grow up, and he's about to make Thor the king, and then the frost giants attack when they hadn't attacked in I don't know, centuries, whatever it is, and Thor leads a group to go to the frost giants and fight with them. It starts a war with them, and Odin says, okay, I'm banishing you to Earth, and I'm taking away your power, and also taking away your hammer, and he throws the hammer somewhere else, and like once Thor's worthy enough, he can have the hammer back. At the same time, Odin goes into this like kind of deep sleep thing, and that means Loki ends up being king. We find out that Loki is the one who has been working with the frost giants to start that war. He's telling Thor that Odin's dead and he can't, he's going to be banished forever. At the same time, he's got other machinations that he's got going on back in Asgard. So while that's happening, Thor is down below. He's dealing with humans. He's got Natalie Portman, who's a scientist, and her other scientist, one played by Kat Denning. The other one's Stellan Skarsgård. Let's see if I get it right. Stellan Skarsgård. That's it. You know the actor. If you see him, you'd know who he is. But anyway, so the goal is that he's got to try to get his hammer back. When he goes and gets the hammer, because the shield guys have it blocked, he can't lift the hammer because he's not worthy of it. So he needs to make himself worthy of it. And at the same time, Loki brings this beast, or this thing called the Destroyer, down to Earth to destroy the town where Thor is hanging out in. Once he's able to sort of overcome that, he gets his power back and he goes back to Asgard and defeats Loki and all that. But one of the things that happens is he has to destroy what they call the Rainbow Bridge, or the Bifrost Bridge, that allows people to travel from Asgard to other planets, and including Earth. And so we were kind of left at the end with him not being able to go back to Earth. So this is a different movie from Iron Man. It's, in terms of it being a personal struggle or development, it's not quite the same as Iron Man's or as Tony Stark's. Granted, Chris Hemsworth is funny as an actor. He's not quite the level of actor as Robert Downey Jr., right? And so that's part of the reason why this isn't as compelling. There's other pieces I think that are really interesting. I mean, the interplay between him and Natalie Portman I thought was really good. I think, it's interesting because in real life, right, Natalie Portman could, she would be sort of at the equal to Chris Hemsworth, or maybe even be like, okay, I'm not interested in dating Chris Hemsworth, like that would be completely conceivable, right? That Natalie Portman is a big enough star that, she would see a Chris Hemsworth and think, okay, whatever. But in a movie, right, she's not Natalie Portman, right? She's a scientist who has just gotten over a divorce, and so when she sees Chris Hemsworth show up with his completely cut figure and his great, Nordic great looks, and all that kind of stuff, she's of course smitten with him. And I think she does a great job of kind of playing that kind of smitten part there with him, but also he's smitten with her as well. He has a thing for her as well. And so that's a piece of this that I really liked. And I'm going to get into some more about that in a bit. I think, obviously the Loki character, right? The Tom Hiddleston, that's the one that ends up being the star, right? And so right now we're getting him here, and he's just the baddie, but he ends up sort of taking over the whole thing. Like, it's just like you want to see Loki. When you start watching these movies further down the road, it's like, well, where's Loki? Where's Loki show up? He ends up getting his own two miniseries, and he gets two seasons of a miniseries so far on Disney Plus. So he's the one that kind of comes out of this, despite the fact that we have, there's going to be 3 more Thor movies after this, which is, I never would have thought that Thor would be big enough that you could have that many movies with him in it. Again, it's still one of those things that the Thor one, I think, is probably bigger than any of them for me to wrap my mind around. The fact that they've made Thor into such a big character in this. Again, he's not the underpinning character, he's not the one that the whole thing's focused around the way that Iron Man is, but he's still an integral part of this. And again, they've made 4 movies with him so there's 3 more that come after this. We just had one this past year. So the fact that it's that big that they've been able to do that with him, it does kind of blow my mind, because I never would have thought Thor. Like, if you were looking at comic book characters to make movies with, if you were asking 10-year-old Matt in the late 80s, like, who would you make a movie with, I wouldn't even list Thor, right? Thor wouldn't even come anywhere on that list. I'd be talking about all the X-Men, which of course I know they're not counted in this, but I mean, Spider-Man, right? All these different characters. The fact that they were able to make Thor this good, I think, is a huge plus there. We also get a tease of Hawkeye, Clint Barton, played by Jeremy Renner. He has one scene in this, or one small piece in this. It would have been kind of nice to see him do something similar to what they did with Black Widow, where she gets her own kind of real introduction where she's beating a bunch of people up. It would have been nice to see something like that with him here, but the fact that we get a little bit there is good. Of course, the other thing too is I'm coming through this from having just seen the Hawkeye series, so obviously in that sense I'm a little bit more biased, because I really liked him in the Hawkeye series, so I'd want to see more of him here. So it's interesting. I'm seeing it. I'm watching this in completely reverse order, right? I'm watching the mini series that came out 10 years after, and wanting to see more of him in this movie when he's just getting his first appearance. And they don't even call him Hawkeye, right? They just call him Clint. And so you just know that he's Hawkeye because he's Clint Barton. But we get that little bit there, which I thought was really cool to see that bit there. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is just about the Natalie Portman, Chris Hemsworth element of this. Because it's an interesting thing that happens in these comic book movies and in sci-fi movies in general, that you have the character who's like the human on Earth who just has faith that the person that's telling them these outlandish stories is telling the truth, right? And so in this case, Natalie Portman just has faith that Chris Hemsworth's character is Thor, that he's everything he's talking about being Thor is true, and that it's all believable, and it's all he's completely being honest with her. And in real life, of course, right, we don't reward faith that same way, right? And when I say faith, I don't mean faith in a religious sense. I just mean faith in other human beings. We don't reward that the same way, right? If I was to be like, I just trust that most people are good, and I'm going to leave my door unlocked, and then some dude breaks in and takes all of our money and beats us up, or maybe even kills us, right? They'd be like, well, why did you leave your door unlocked? Of course, if I'm dead, you wouldn't, they'd be talking about it. Without me being able to know that they were saying it, but right, you'd be like, why would it's like, well, I had faith that no one would want to rob me, and it's like, well, no, of course people, and it's same thing too. I think with these liars, right? When we think of like scam artists, there's always this piece in the scam where there's almost a sense of it's like the victim's own fault. Like why did you believe that guy said he was a Greek, prince, or the heir to a Greek fortune when he's wearing the same dirty polo shirt every day, or whatever. And, it's almost like you could have had an alternate version of this movie where Chris Hemsworth's character isn't Thor and Natalie Portman's character believes him, and he's just like sleeping on her couch and like running up huge, bills on her credit card, and like, using that credit card to go to strip clubs and hook up with other women and just doing all of this other stuff. And she's just like, but you're Thor. And he's like, I know I'm Thor, and all this other thing, and then, then there's like the podcast about it after. Oh, this beautiful blonde Australian guy was going around telling everybody he's Thor and ripping women off for tens of thousands of dollars, and that's I don't know what you call it, the Thor scammer or something like that, and it would be this really highly successful podcast that like the person who did it is making, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars off of, and these poor women have just been all scammed by Chris Hemsworth. I mean, even with the Australian accent, right, that would be just absolutely fantastic. I don't know if I can pull it right here, if I'd be like, no, I have this great deal here. It's a fantastic idea. We're doing a resort that's down in off the coast of Melbourne, and it could be worth millions of dollars. And I know your grandfather, he just gave you $50,000, and he would just love to see your $50,000 turned into millions of dollars. If you could give me that $50,000, I guarantee we will absolutely make millions of dollars. And then, of course, later on, of course, he runs off with the $50,000, and that's it. But she's just so like, enamored with that the Australian accent and the beautiful blue eyes and the ripped abs and all of that stuff that she just can't not give him the $50,000 she inherited from her grandfather, and he walks out with it. It would be interesting, even if just like the whole movie was like, from that point where he says he's Thor and she believes him, if suddenly he's not Thor, right? If he's just a scam artist. But it is just one of those things that I guess with these movies, right? It's the faith is always rewarded, right? Natalie Portman's faith in Thor is not only it's rewarded, right? But from us, as the film standpoint, right? We have all the information, right? It almost never works out in one of these movies that like, this blonde guy shows up and we don't know who he is. And he says he's Thor, and we have to decide for ourselves if we believe him, right? It almost never works out that way. No, we get the backstory in Asgard, and we get to see how he's this really great, he's Thor. We know he's Thor. And so now we're just like, oh, come on, Natalie Portman, believe him that he's Thor. Just do it. It's kind of a whole different vibe from what, instead of, so it's almost like one of those things where we want her to have faith, right? We need her to have faith, and it's almost like, wow, how can you not believe him? He's so Thor, because we all know it. As opposed to the other way around, where it'd be like, if we had to believe it too, like if we get to the end of the movie and like, do we believe he's Thor or not, or did he just run out with all of Natalie Portman's money and he's moving on to the next scam, a couple hours away in the next town over, setting up his dating profile to find if there's maybe a widow or something that he could rip off. And of course, I'm saying it's just from a women's standpoint. It's not that men can't be, he could be in that small town in New Mexico with his Australian accent, just ripping off all kinds of people, right? He could be in the diner. Oh, he got $10,000. That's fantastic. Like I said, I've got this really great resort deal going on down in Melbourne, Australia. I could show you pictures of it. It looks beautiful. It's right off a coral reef, and just give that that $20,000. That'd be fantastic. I could turn it into 500,000 in no time. That's I mean he could have scammed that whole town, and then Loki shows up and takes him back to Asgard. But anyway, but again, it's just that idea. When I was watching this, just thinking about this fact that we just sort of take for granted, right? That these characters have faith, and that's how it is. Okay, kind of beyond that piece. One of the things I wanted to bring up, sort of in conjunction with this movie, 2011, we talked about 2009 being a year where there was only, or 2010, sorry, that 2010 only had the one comic book movie, whereas 2011, right, was a big year for comic book movies. It had, what do we have? This movie, where we had Thor, we had the Captain America movie coming out a couple months later. So just within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they had 2 films come out. And then you also had the Green Lantern movie come out in 2011. And then on top of that, one that I want to talk about is X-Men First Class that also came out this year, because we talked about in the previous segment about X-Men Origins Wolverine. And so it's interesting, right, to kind of see X-Men First Class come out, and it would have come out. It would have been around, but it would have been in the theater the same time as Thor. It came out in June of 2011. Thor was May of 2011. So they would have been out around the same time. But I really liked X-Men First Class as a movie. I hadn't seen it before, and I figured I'd watch it for this. It doesn't do it as well. It does about $100 million less than Thor. It doesn't quite do the same number that X-Men Origins Wolverine, maybe $3 million shy of it, but it's essentially kind of does roughly that same number. I thought it was a better movie. I liked it better than Thor, to be honest. I really liked the idea of them doing X-Men in the 60s. I like the idea of, for example, Professor X not being completely the nicest guy ever, and kind of being a womanizer and breaking Mystique's heart. Those kinds of elements were really cool. I mean, January Jones as Emma Frost. I mean, you watch Mad Men and she played. When you look at her as Betty in Mad Men, I mean, X-Men First Class, that's the movie that you'd want to see her in, the hot 60s outfits, right? That's really that's the January Jones I think people thought they were getting when they watched Mad Men, and she kind of just, it's almost like the movie kind of gives you that piece of it. She's fantastic as Emma Frost. I think she's really great in that role, and kind of very different from who she plays on Mad Men. So, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. I mean, of course, the outfits that all the characters were wearing are probably more late 60s, and the movie takes place in the early 60s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But, just the way that those things were developed. And Michael Fassbender is one of my favorite actors. I loved him as Magneto. Kevin Bacon as Sebastian Shaw was fantastic. Again, one of those baddies that's kind of similar to a Mickey Rourke, coming into a movie and giving the movie a little bit more as the baddie. I thought that was all really good. You do kind of wonder if the stink from X-Men Origins Wolverine was still on that, because I know it was for me. I know when I saw that movie that was in the theater, I didn't want anything to do with it, because I was just I'm done with Fox and X movies. I didn't bother with it, and I just came back to it now. 13 years later, I'm finally watching it. So I know for me, I was one who was no, I'm kind of done with these X movies, and I didn't really come back to them at all. I mean, I didn't even end up watching Logan. I still need to see that one, but. And I think in terms of movie fans, right, I think, the one that people come back to eventually is Days of Future Past, right? That's the one. But if you look at when that movie comes out, it's kind of in this window where a lot of comic book movies are doing really big. And, again, we talked about with sort of that lead up to an Avengers movie. It seems like with these Avengers movies, it's like one of those things where it's like a sea that raises all boats. And so that movie ends up doing really well as a result. I mean, of course, Deadpool was one that people liked, but it starts to kind of, drop a little bit, after that, with those movies. And I mean, the one that they wrap with, what was that one? It was Dark Phoenix, right? That one, it barely even made its money back, right? It was, so poorly. But I mean, they get some other hits in there. They do some other ones that do well. And of course, Logan was one that was critically good. But Deadpool, which I mean, again, suddenly they get Deadpool right, and they're pulling in $750 million. It's that's a crazy idea, huh? That you actually, and they didn't even fully get Deadpool right, to be honest. When they made him in the first movie, it was some weird thing where he's suffocated, and it causes him to mutate, as opposed to in the comic books where he gets Wolverine's healing power, and that's what makes him mutate or whatever, which was a cooler idea, and I don't know why they couldn't do that. It's really weird why they decide not to do what was done in the comic books. What makes them decide to do weird things with these? But even then, it was still close enough to Deadpool that, yeah, he pulled in $750 million. But anyway, I'm kind of getting off track here. What I was saying is I really liked X-Men First Class, but yeah, it was a movie that I do think there was a sense of like, I don't know if we trust this movie, after that. But after what happened with X-Men's Origin Wolverine, and I think it's one of those things too that what we're seeing, because there were a few things that happened with X-Men First Class. I mean, first off, they were going to do an X-Men Origins Magneto, but because X-Men Origins Wolverine was so poorly received, they took elements of X-Men Origins Magneto and put it into X-Men First Class. So that's one of the pieces, right, of that movie. And that's why you get like kind of the Magneto origin in there a little bit more. That's part of it, is that when these movies, if you sort of have these plans of how you're going to make these movies, and then if one of them bombs, they have to sort of change course. I think the other thing is I don't know if at that time Fox knew that they were in the kind of trouble that they thought that they would end up being in with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because again, Avengers comes out the next year, comes out in 2012, and that's the one that pulls in $1.5 billion. But I think if I'm Fox at that time, I'm still looking at it as like, hey, they've got Iron Man, they've got Thor, they're going to do a Captain America, so I mean he's bigger, but we've got the X-Men, right? We've got Wolverine, we've got all of these characters we can pull from. When you think of the top properties in Marvel at that time, right? When you think of which ones were the biggest ones, I was talking about like Hulk, last episode about Hulk being a really big one. But the X-Men were probably the biggest one for them. Maybe Spider-Man and X-Men together, those would be your biggest ones from Marvel. And so I think it's really interesting, right, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is almost like they're kind of, I don't know, like I'm like fighting with one hand tied behind them, but they don't have their full arsenal, and yet they're somehow eclipsing X-Men, and we're going to see, right, with the two Amazing Spider-Man movies that they try to make with with Andrew Garfield, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is somehow able to make Thor and Iron Man, right, bigger than the X-Men, and bigger than Spider-Man, which is just crazy, right? But I think at the time, I think they would have thought it was crazy too. I mean, I don't know fully what was going on, with Fox when they were making these movies and what their plans were, or that kind of thing. But I do know that I think at that time, I don't think there was a sense that Marvel was going to pass them the way they do. And it's really the next year that it happens, which when we get to the next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, I was trying to think like, well, could Fox have done the same thing that Marvel did, right? Where you had these sort of individual stories that lead to a big, kind of group X-Men movie the way that they did with the Avengers. Because again, from a team standpoint, right? I mean, the X-Men killed the Avengers. I mean, the Avengers, I think, had two comics when I was collecting. They had West Coast Avengers and they had Avengers. And not long after I started collecting, West Coast Avengers went away. They just did away with that. So it was just the Avengers. And I think, for the most part, they kept the Avengers going because they, when I was collecting, not later, because I know later they revamped them and it became a more popular comic book. But when I was collecting, I think they just kept the Avengers going because they had to. It was a legacy book, right? You can't stop making the Avengers. And eventually they would do things like they added Wolverine to the Avengers. They had some really cool ideas that they did. But at the time, it really wasn't a big deal. Whereas you had X-Men. I mean, you have the Uncanny X-Men book. You had the X-Men one that was started by Jim Lee, right, just before he goes to Image. And then New Mutants was changed into X-Force, right? You also had X-Factor. So there was a lot of properties going on with those books. There was a lot more going on with X-Men than there was with Avengers. And so you feel like they could have maybe done something similar where maybe you have a story with a few X-Men here and a few here, and then you kind of build to this big, something the way that they did with these movies where they would, do a movie here or there and build to the big one. But I don't know if they were capable of doing that. I just watching what they did with these X books, I don't know if they could have pulled it off. And it's interesting because it was there for them to do, I think. For example, one of the biggest problems I had with the early X-Men movies was that you had Cyclops and Storm in the same group when in the comic books, right, Cyclops led one team of X-Men, Storm led another team. And I think they were trying to split the difference because they were like, well, we can't make the movie without Storm because it might look, they felt like they needed to have Storm in the movies, but they couldn't make it without Cyclops either. So he had to be the leader and she was kind of like a secondary leader. And it just, none of it ever worked. When they could have made, one X-Men movie with one group and an X-Men movie with another group and kind of built to this big finale. But honestly, I don't know if any of them were thinking that way, right? Because what Marvel was trying to do here was so new to comic book movies that I don't think any of them had the foresight to say like, oh, what if we built this bigger thing over like 5 or 6 movies over like a 4 or 5 year period, and see what it looks like at the end. Now, granted, Disney takes this whole thing to another level where it's gotten to be too big, right? That they're building too many pieces and there's too much stuff to keep track of. I mean, just to think of it, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Phase 1 and Phase 2 are both 6 movies, and that's it, with some extras, right, that are featured in some of the DVDs. And then you get to the third one, and it's 11 movies, right? So you're already almost jumping up double for that one. And then you start getting into these ones where you've got, series and movies mixed together, and it's just hours upon hours of content. So there is like kind of a happy medium to it. But these 6 movie arcs that they're doing here, nobody's really doing it. And I think this is where I think Fox gets past, and they're kind of struggling by trying to just make. I mean, I almost think that they made Deadpool begrudgingly. I don't think they wanted to make Deadpool. They didn't want to make an R-rated comic book movie. I don't think based on how they treated him in X-Men Origins Wolverine, I don't think they liked that character in the comic books, and they didn't think they could use him because he is an R-rated character. And when they do use him, they don't even fully integrate him in with the rest of the X series. So even then, it's not like they do it properly, right? I mean, you have some. He has some X-Men in his movies, but there's not the whole crew, right? Like, it's not like one of those things where it's like, Deadpool stories are linked in with, the Age of Apocalypse or any of that other stuff, right? So they're not really doing it right. They're not getting it right the way that Marvel was getting it right. And I think that's something that, as we get into the last 2 movies of this, is just to see to the degree to which Marvel gets it right to this point. And I don't think they get everything right. I think, again, I think Thor is a good enough movie. Critically, it kind of got mixed reviews, but I think it's a good enough movie. I think it's the thing with the Thor movies is they're all good enough, right? And I think for what Thor movies are supposed to be, which is a cog in a greater storyline, they all work to that level. They all work on that sense, and I almost feel like it's to convince any, and we saw with the most recent Thor movie, right, that it didn't do as well, and I think people were. Talking about that as sort of like a failure on its part, right? That it didn't do as well. I'm trying to think what it did make. Actually, it still made $750 million, or $750 million. So it's not like it did horribly. That's the thing too, right? Is that there's this idea that all of these movies need to make $1 billion, and I guess Doctor Strange's movie did, right? It made almost $1 billion. Came out a month before. So I don't think all these movies should have to make $1 billion. I think a Thor movie that makes, $750 million, I think you take that and you run with it. But again, if the budget's going to be $200 million, I don't think the budget needs to be $200 million for a Thor movie either. I think you can make a Thor movie for 120, and I think that's what this one was 150. So even in that sense, and have it be 150 and make $750 million, you're in good shape. But again, it's kind of what I was talking about with these movies, that the solo ones almost never do $1 billion, right? Unless they're linked, more closely linked to the Avengers movies. I think the best example of that is Captain Marvel. Right, Captain Marvel comes out in between 2 Avengers movies. Right, it comes out in 2019. A month before Avengers Endgame comes out. And so everybody was so hyped for Avengers Endgame. They were like, yeah, let's go check out this Captain Marvel movie. And then they make another Captain Marvel. And they're like, well, we made $1 billion the first time. We'll make $1 billion again. We'll just, put more money into it. And it'll definitely be $1 billion. But it's like, no, that's not why Captain Marvel made $1 billion. It made it because everybody was like hyped for all these Avengers movies. And this one came out in between them. You also look at Ant-Man and the Wasp made, $600 million, which that's a lot for Ant-Man, right? I mean, Ant-Man should be making like $300 or $400 million. So the fact that, it's part of it. So I guess, kind of getting back to what I was saying about Thor, because I kind of just got off track there about Thor. But, these Thor movies, they're I don't know, I saw Thor Ragnarok. That's the one that I remember seeing. And I did see part 2 when it was on cable. But they're they're just kind of a means to get us to that next Avengers movie. And I think it's part of the problem with the most recent one that came out, Love and Thunder, is that we don't have an Avengers movie on the horizon. And I think Thor's not really. I don't know. I don't see him as like kind of a standalone. I mean, the movie still made a good amount of money, so it's not like it's a complete wash. But yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm kind of going all over the map here with Thor. But again, I just getting back to the kind of the final points on it, that the fact that they've made Thor into a movie franchise that can make you $750 million on a standalone film. And that his character, the Loki character in particular, has become so iconic that everybody's naming their animals after him, and everybody loves the Tom Hiddleston, and they want to see more of him. I think that's just another sign of just sort of how Marvel's able to make, the Marvel Studios were able to make this work. Thor should not be out-earning X-Men movies, ever. No Thor movie should ever do better than an X-Men movie. It should never happen. And the fact that it's happened on multiple occasions is just astounding. The fact that a Thor movie could do better than a Wolverine movie, again, it should never happen. Or Thor should never do better than a Spider-Man movie, right? And I'm just looking at like the sequel, right? So Thor 2 comes out in 2013, and then 2014, right? You get the Spider-Man movie. They're only about 60 million apart, right? They're close. So the fact that Thor is close to a Captain America movie, a Spider-Man movie, and is better than an X-Men movie or a Wolverine movie, that should never happen. This also comes up later with Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy, that was like another one that was like, we're going to try it out for a year, and then nobody's going to subscribe to it, nobody's going to buy it, so we're just going to take it off the shelves again. I want to say, I don't know if it was Mark Silvestri, one of the Image guys, I think, worked on Guardians of the Galaxy before he moved over to Image. I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it was Mark Silvestri. I think it was another one. But anyway, those comics should not be pulling in the money that they do. Those are properties that should not be. The fact that they've made these into that kind of compelling thing, I think it shows that if you make a movie the right way, you can, the audience will be there for it if you make it the right way. The property itself can be turned into something bigger, which I think is a really important piece of this. And yeah, something I think is big. The last thing I wanted to mention as I'm wrapping up here, I was reading one of these clickbait articles that ranked, talked about comic book movies, and they had Blade on the top of their list. They thought, they listed Blade as being a really great comic book movie. And the reason that they gave was that they were saying how Blade kind of opened the door for these sort of lesser characters to get their own movies, that it kind of made it okay for them to get their own movies. And I kind of disagree with that, because I think Blade is its own thing. Like, Blade is not he's a Marvel character, but the movies are not Marvel movies. Yes, yes, Marvel is involved with the making of the movies, but they're not like in part of this greater Marvel universe. He's not depicted as a Marvel character in that sense. It's kind of the same way like the first Punisher, right? The Dolph Lundgren Punisher. It's not really a Marvel movie, right? He's not as a Marvel character. He just happens to be a Marvel character, but they're making a movie about him. And that's kind of how I kind of felt about Blade. Now, I love the Blade movie, especially 1 and 2. And I think it'd be great to see him sort of in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I think is something that they're working on doing now. But I think it's more what's done here with Iron Man and Thor that really opens the door. And again, you see them trying it with varying degrees of success with other characters. I mean, it really works with Guardians of the Galaxy, which, again, blows my mind. Blows my mind that they just had a Guardians of the Galaxy, a third movie come out, and it made, $800 million? I mean, that's that big. And I know people talking about, oh, yeah, I'm going to see that one in the theater. I'm going to watch the first 2 again. I've seen the first one. I haven't seen the second one or the third one yet. But there's no reason that those movies should be that big. I mean, Ant-Man, of course, doesn't do that well. And it's like, again, it shouldn't do that well. Ant-Man was such a small character in Marvel that, yes, that none of them should do that well. So it's an utterly fascinating thing. And I think it does show that, these characters, if you put the right story behind them and you make it compelling and fun enough, that any of them can be big enough. That it doesn't have to be Spider-Man, it doesn't have to be Wolverine. But on the other hand, this other piece of me is like, but if you've got Wolverine and you got Spider-Man, how are you not turning out, something that sells more than these other ones? How are you not turning out something that's a bigger hit, a better movie? So there's that other side of it, right? That okay, yes, you've got these characters that are lesser ones that are becoming bigger, which is, again, it just still kind of blows my mind. But yet these other bigger characters, can't you do more with them? So it's going to be interesting this year to see what Marvel does with Deadpool. Now that Disney and Marvel Studios has Deadpool, it'll be interesting to see what they do with that. I know there's some interesting elements there where there's going to be it's going to have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, also probably going to have Jennifer Garner as Elektra, which is going to be interesting as well because there's this idea, right, that the Daredevil movies are part of the MCU as well, and they have a different Elektra in them. So that'll be interesting. I mean, he's probably going to play with the whole multiverse thing, which I think is another area of this. It's just so all over the place. Is the whole multiverse thing. It's too much for me, I think. But anyway, I'm kind of going all over the place here, so it's probably time for us to wrap this up. But yeah, I mean, Thor, again, this is my first time seeing Thor. I think it's good enough, right? It's a good enough movie. It's not going to make any kind of top comic book movie lists of mine. I don't think Iron Man 2 necessarily would either, but I liked it better. But it is, I think again, it is interesting that how the Marvel Cinematic, how they pulled this off, right? That Thor is that big of a deal, right? That the guy that was like the quirky, the sister and Adventures of Babysitters dressed up as Thor, and it's a big joke, right? It's a big quirky, goofy thing. That the old comics that I used to see in the yard sales that I wouldn't touch because I was like, well, I don't want Thor, That guy is a big star. And I guess it does help that Chris Hemsworth is good in the role, but I think it's just kind of the whole thing. This Marvel Cinematic Universe that they looked at some characters that everybody else would be like, I don't know what I want to do with those ones. And they made it into something bigger. And so, again, when we get to the next episode of this, the podcast episode of this, we're going to be talking about the Captain America movie, which will be good because we'll be able to get into the Albert Pyun Captain America. I talked about the Red Brown Captain America, so we'll be able to talk about some other elements of that. And then we're going to get into Avengers. I haven't seen Avengers yet, so it'll be my first time seeing Avengers, so it'll be kind of cool to watch it for this. So that's it. So we'll wrap up here. Just to do some quick plugs, of course, dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's where you can go to find everything. So that's where the blog is, links to the novels. As I tell people, your best bet is to, if you're using a mobile device, page down to the bottom and click on View Web Browser, because that gives you all the sidebar options. So you can see, my novel ads, but also you can see things like the A to Z archive, which again, I'm still in the process of updating. You can see the tags on the right hand to see like how many movies a certain person has. You can see, the Hall of Fame lists that we have, the 40 Club, 50 Club, et cetera, and some of those kinds of things. Who's in our Hall of Fame, all those kinds of things. Those are all on the sidebar. My letterbox list as well, they're on the sidebar. So your best bet is to, on the site, if you're on a computer, everything's going to be there. But if you're on your mobile device, you page down View Web version, you'll be able to see everything that's there. And then again, my novels, Don's House in the Mountains. Again, happy people that have been buying that one. Check that one out on Amazon, either Kindle or paperback. And of course, Bainbridge, my short action novel, which again I think would really, something that listeners of this podcast will really enjoy. Definitely check those out. But we'll wrap up here. So thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye everyone.
Direct